Hey guys, I'm Bruce. I'm a noob. Welcome back to my buddy build, part 2 of the buddy build with Panzermeister36 and Adam Mann, building Dragon's final production Panzer IV L70A, that sexiest of tank destroyers, using an unmodified Panzer IV hull with a very modified Panzer IV L70V superstructure. So we got the suspension and the hull done in part 1. And everything went together flawlessly. This kit so far is extremely well engineered. Everything went together great. And now we're going to move on to the back of the hull, starting with the mufflers. And you can see, sort of mid and late Panzer IVJs, this vehicle has the twin flame suppressing mufflers. There was a bit of a mold parting seam up the middle of these, but there was not anything resembling the proper weld bead that should be there. So we dab on some stretch sprue with some Tamiya extra thin, get the hobby knife out, and alternate back and forth between Tamiya extra thin and the knife to generate those nice weld seams. You'll see I've also got the very late toe coupling on this. This was added very late in Panzer IV production. I've only seen one L70A with that on, but I wanted to do it because it is such a cool feature. So we get the weld seams done. We've got the inertial starter guide cover on there. We've got the idlers on there as well. The ones in the kit, as we talked about last week, the ones in the instructions aren't actually the right ones, so be careful there. Now, the spare tracks. They give you special spare tracks on the sprue that are going to be mounted on the upper glacis. Those are Type 5s, which are fine for a late Panzer IV, mid to late Panzer IVJ. Unfortunately, the L70A, along with the L70V and the Brumbar, use Type 7s, and they're not compatible. They don't fit. So we had to actually use some of the magic tracks from the kit. I've drilled out holes in them using the plastic mounting points and actually putting some stretch sprue in there because you actually need to see the track pins, because the track pins are what actually held the spare tracks into the bracket. So you also see I've got the handles on the brake covers. That was a Panzer IVJ very late thing. I've never seen an L70A with those on them, but I really like them. So I use them, and that's probably about as fictional as I'm going to get with this build, but it's a neat feature. The bar on the front of the lower glacis there that actually holds on the spare tracks, that's not called out in the instructions. It just shows you putting spare tracks on the kit. That part is on the sprue. I think it's the D sprue, I can't remember, but you'll be able to see it. It's pretty distinctive. And you'll notice here there's a slight little gap where the upper glacis meets the front armor. There is a recessed weld seam there, but it didn't quite pull close together for me. So luckily, the weld seam on the real thing is actually slightly proud of the surface, not recessed like in the kit. So out comes the stretch sprue again, and we're going to put a proper raised weld seam along this joint, and that's going to help conceal that slight little gap there. So again, alternating some Tamiya extra thin and the hobby knife along that whole length, and we'll get a nice weld seam there that'll be a bit more realistic. Now we're going to move on to the engine deck, and you can see on the L70A, that's where all the tools went, or most of the tools. Not on the fenders, because of course most of the fenders are actually covered by superstructure. This went together very nicely. The engine hatches were really nice, two parts. You could pose them open if you wanted to put in an engine and fit it all out with detail. Not doing that in this case. You can see we've got the squared off cover for the radiator fill points. That was again a sort of a mid-J feature. It used to be angled on the earlier Panzer IVs. And we had to drill out some holes there for the second handle on the engine hatch. Again, a J feature. But other than that, there's only holes for the spare wheel holders. And so I actually just cut the nubs off. I could have drilled through from the back. There are recesses there to drill through for all the tool locations, but I've just cut the nubs off, and I'm manually positioning all the tools. I think that I just like that. It gives me more flexibility, and I'm trying to match all the tool locations on the Samur Panzer IV L70A, which is slightly earlier production than this, but it should be pretty consistent. So you see there's actually recesses both on the hull and on the fire extinguisher. I'll just position it manually again and just put a few dabs of glue on there. The kit does not call out a C-clamp holder. There is evidence that there was a C-clamp holder mounted on that, and you'll see that later on. This is the inertial starter handle, not the one I'm using. I'm using the curvy one. Unfortunately, the clamps are actually in the wrong place. The clamps should be parallel to each other, not offset 90 degrees. So I cut the clamps off and rebuilt most of the inertial starter using some evergreen styrene rod. So this vehicle has a really neat feature. In the loader's hatch, there's actually a sort of 90-degree bent tube that sticks out through a little mounting point, and you would attach a Pz.Kpfw to the inside of that. And the bent tube would actually bend the path of the bullet, so you could fire with the weapon vertically inside the vehicle, but then they would come out horizontally, presumably to sweep, Russian infantry off the roof of your vehicle. So that's kind of cool. We hollowed it out a little bit just to make it a little more believable that you could fit the barrel of a rifle in there. The mounting point itself, the tube should come out the center. Here's the only picture I found of one. But Dragon's mounting point actually has it orientated so it looks like it wants you to kind of have it pointing forward, but from the side of the mounting point. So I had to figure around with this a little bit. I think I finally got it sort of more or less where it should be, but it was just a bit of a strange part there. So now we're going to move on to the hinges for the hatches on the roof. These are the hinge assemblies, so two sort of D-shaped brackets and two what look like springs. These were an absolute nightmare to get together and have them all line up at 90-degree angles, because there's just not a solid enough attachment between the springs and the D-shaped brackets on the side. So there's one that kind of tried to put them together sort of half first and then half later. I actually broke the part there that's in the tweezers right now. So I'd recommend glue the brackets to the underside of the roof first, and then glue your springs on. So now we're going to move on to the gun. This went together fantastically. This was a real feat of model making engineering, I have to say. Absolutely no issues whatsoever. I love the way it went together, and I really think it's a shame that you're not going to be able to see really any of this once the kit's built. It would almost be worth building this kit with like a crane, hauling the gun out from the front of the superstructure for maintenance or something, just so you could actually see what a beautiful job Dragon did engineering this L70 gun breech. Lots of little parts, but they all again went together flawlessly. You'd probably have some filling to do if you were going to have it visible, but it just is so cool. We've got now this is neat. You're going to see you're putting on a little sort of gear, arc gear here, and in a minute we're going to be actually putting in a little cog. And the two intermesh, and when you move the barrel up and down, the little gear actually turns and runs along that arced gear piece. It is so cool. But yeah, it went together great. We've got a one-piece slide molded barrel, just a very slight mold separation seam there, but otherwise very, very nicely molded. So I just very gently with the hobby knife scraped the seam off so as to not leave a flat point. And then once that was done, we just went over it with some really fine, a really fine sanding stick, and it came out really nicely. You could probably replace it with metal if you wanted to, but I don't think you need to. I think this is a very nicely molded barrel. And then that just fits into the breech, again effortlessly, like everything just fit like a glove. And then that inserts in there through the rest of the breech assembly, pops into place beautifully. A bit of a dab of glue, and we've got a really nice assembly. There's that gear, and you can see it there. It's actually spinning as it goes up and down that arced gear piece. Now the sight goes on. This was about 3 parts, no issues. But you see everything's got positive fit. It's got locating tabs. Now, like in a lot of Dragon kits, the actual gun sight itself is a clear part. That's not going to be a problem. We'll dab a little dab of liquid mask on each end, the ends that are supposed to be clear, before we paint it, and then just take them off after painting. This piece, which I think is the traverse assembly, or is it the elevation, I'm not sure, but that is super delicate. When you take that off and you're cleaning off the mold lines, be super careful, and it fits in place. There's a nice little positive locking tab there. And then finally the other wheel, which is either the traverse or the elevation, depending on what the other one is, it goes on nicely too, and just a bit of an adjustment, and the gun is done. And that's, again, an absolute work of art. So now we got Q21 and F4 there. Those are both cast parts in the real world. So they're going to have that cast texture on them, which is really nice. F4, the mantlet. Q21, I don't know if that's the casement, or I'm not sure what that's called. But there it is there. You can see there's a noticeable seam on top. Do not sand that off. That's actually a real world cast mark that's replicated on the part itself, but you can see where my thumb is. There is a tiny bit of an injection molding seam, unfortunately, that we are going to have to scrape off. So we get the craft knife out. It comes off pretty easily, but of course now we're scraping off cast texture. And again, Dragon did a really nice job with the cast textures on these parts. So we're going to have to replace that. So Mr. Surfacer, I'm using Mr. Surfacer 1000. A lot of people use 500. I find 1000 is adequate. And you just get it on it, and as it sort of starts to set up a little bit and you dab it with the brush, that's where you get the really nice little bumps that again we're camouflaging where we scraped off that molding seam, and just feather it out towards the edges so you don't have a noticeable difference in the texture that you added versus the kit parts. Now they give you these really cool little cast mark numbers that you could scrape off and glue onto the cast parts. I've never seen these used on any of the big cast parts on an L70A. I would love to use them. I'm going to save them for a future build. Here's the mantlet, and there is a slight mold seam. Just you can see where the actual nub is there from the mold sprue gate. There is a slight mold injection seam there, so we're going to have to scrape that off and repeat what we did before. But also there's something missing from this mantlet, and if you look at the Samur 70A, you can see there's actually a very slight cast seam mark there, just right down the middle of that mantlet. So we're going to again stretch sprue to the rescue. That seam in real life is very subtle. In fact, I think I probably used stretch sprue here that's actually too thick. I'm going to probably have to go in and sand it down a little bit, knock it down a bit, because once I'm done here, you'll see I think it's actually a little too noticeable compared to how subtle it is on the real vehicle. But again, just I started off just at the end there, let that set up, and then carried on. Luckily, it kind of goes right down the middle over that little hole, which of course we'll cut the sprue away from once we're all done. Yeah, we'll get her in place. And now, of course, this isn't a weld seam, so we're not going to get the knife in there and give it that nice welded texture. We're going to leave it pretty much alone once it's in place and set up. But we do want to blend it in a little bit, right? Again, because this was part of the cast metal, just like the rest of the mantlet was. So it's going to be a little bumpy, and we want it to blend really nicely. So again, we'll nip off the ends once it's all set up, and then we'll get the Mr. Surfacer out again and start to try to blend it in. And again, this went pretty well. I think I probably need to either apply a bit more, seeing how it turned out, or again, I need to get the sanding stick out and maybe just knock back that weld seam a little bit. It went okay, but I think it's still a bit too prominent compared to the pictures of the real ones. So here we are now, the end of part 2 of the build series, looking at Dragon's final Panzer IV L70A. The buddy build with Panzermeister36 and Adam Mann. So we've got the hull and suspension done last time. This time we got the engine deck. You can see the C-clamps and the jack are on there now. I've only put one C-clamp on there because I have a plan for the second C-clamp. We've got that amazing gun. What an absolute work of skill model engineering by Dragon. The superstructure roof now with the hatches in place. And of course the fenders were done last time. So we're well positioned. Hopefully, if all comes to pass, next episode we'll get the primary construction done. Certainly the vehicle will be done. I can't promise we'll get the side skirts all finished next time. We'll see what we can do. From what I understand, they're pretty complex and a little fiddly. So we'll try to get that done and then power on into paint after that. So in the meantime, I'm Bruce. I'm a noob. Thanks for watching, guys. Really hope you've enjoyed the video. Please consider clicking like and clicking subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.